The portrait of the Fenwick sisters hangs in the collection of the Dorset County Museum in Dorchester, where it has been since 1974, when it was donated along with the remaining effects of the Fenwick estate in the specific way that things are donated when there is no one left to have a personal interest in their disposition, by a solicitor's firm, on behalf of a trust, without ceremony or explanation. It is not among the museum's most significant holdings. It is a competent Edwardian portrait, approximately 4 feet by 3 feet in its gold frame, executed in the oil on canvas style of the period by the Harbour Portrait Studio of Bournemouth, which was a commercial portraiture operation that produced a great many similar works for the prosperous families of the Dorset and Hampshire coasts in the first decades of the 20th century. The studio's work is identifiable by the specific quality of its backgrounds. A dark paneled interior with a suggestion of flowers that the studio used as a standard setting for its formal sittings. The specific theatrical backdrop of a commercial portraiture operation that has worked out the most efficient way to convey respectability in the least amount of setup time. The portrait shows 2 young women in the Sister Portrait Convention of 1901, the elder seated, the younger standing beside her, both in the high-necked afternoon dress of the Edwardian period, both looking toward the viewer with the composed expressions of women who have been directed by the photographer or painter to look composed. The elder is identified on the portrait's frame label as Eleanor Fenwick, aged 22. The younger is identified as Catherine Fenwick, aged 16. The portrait is dated 1901. In 2019, the museum undertook a routine restoration assessment of the Edwardian collection, which included the Fenwick portrait. The conservator who examined the portrait, a woman named Dr. Sarah Marsh, who had been working in conservation for 18 years and who had seen a great many Edwardian family portraits in the course of those 18 years, examined the portrait with the standard battery of imaging techniques: visible light photography, infrared reflectography to reveal underdrawing, X-ray imaging to show the construction of the paint layers. She was 3 hours into the examination when she looked at the high-resolution visible light photography of the portrait's central section, and she stopped, and she looked more carefully at a detail she had passed over in the first examination, and that she had assessed as a compositional element of the dress, and that she was now reassessing as something else. She enlarged the image on the monitor. She looked at Eleanor Fenwick's right hand. Eleanor Fenwick's right hand is positioned in the portrait between the 2 women's bodies, in the compositional convention of the sister portrait, where one subject's arm or hand creates a connecting element between the 2 figures, suggesting the bond between them. In the standard viewing of the portrait, at gallery distance, in the amber light of a museum room, the hand is present but not prominent. It is compositionally necessary and visually unremarkable. You look past it toward the faces, which is where the eye is directed in a portrait, and the hand exists at the periphery of your attention as a structural element of the composition. At the resolution of the restoration photography, enlarged to 4 times the normal viewing size, the hand became something different. The knuckles were white. Dr. Marsh had been looking at painted hands for 18 years, and she understood the difference between the painted convention of a relaxed hand and the painted reality of a tense one, and what she was looking at 4 times enlargement was a tense hand, a hand whose knuckles the painter had rendered with the specific accuracy of direct observation. He had been looking at Eleanor Fenwick's hand during the sitting, and he had painted what he saw, which was a hand holding something very tightly, and he had either not noticed what the hand was holding or he had noticed and had continued painting, and either way, the specific reality of the grip had been captured in the painting and was now visible in the restoration photography at a resolution that the painter had not anticipated, and that the sisters had not anticipated, and that the guardian who had commissioned the portrait had not anticipated. Between Eleanor Fenwick's white-knuckled fingers, in the fold of Catherine's skirt beside the point of contact between the 2 women, there was an edge, a thin edge of paper, folded, almost entirely concealed within the layers of the fabric, but not entirely. The edge was visible at the 4 times enlargement by the difference in texture between the fabric and the paper, the specific quality of each material rendered by the painter with the unconscious accuracy of someone working from direct observation, and the paper's texture was different from the fabric's texture, and the difference was visible. Eleanor Fenwick was holding a piece of paper in a grip that was white-knuckled with the force of the holding, between the folds of her younger sister's skirt. In a 1901 family portrait commissioned to document the contented domestic life of 2 well-positioned orphaned sisters in the care of their guardian. Dr. Marsh sat back from the monitor. She was an art conservator of 18 years' experience, and she had seen things in paintings that paintings had not been intended to show, because this is what high-resolution imaging does when it is applied to images that were made at a lower resolution than the imaging can see. It reveals the gap between what was intended and what was recorded, and the gap is sometimes the most significant part of what the painting contains. She had not seen anything like this before, not specifically like this. Not a hand holding a piece of paper in a grip that told you everything you needed to know about the relationship between the person gripping and the person being gripped, if you were paying attention to the grip rather than to the composition it was embedded in. She photographed the detail. She documented it in the restoration record. She wrote in the record, hand detail, figure right, shows object concealed within grip. Object appears to be folded paper. Hand position suggests deliberate concealment. Recommend further investigation of portrait's provenance and the family history. She had always been the kind of conservator who followed the recommendation she wrote in her own record. She began investigating the Fenwick family's history. The Fenwick family archive, such as it was in the museum's records from the 1974 donation. What the solicitor's firm had donated alongside the portrait was a single box of documents, not the full family archive, which had not survived the intervening decades between the estate's effective dissolution and the donation, but the documents that the solicitor's firm had retained in the normal course of their administration of the Fenwick Trust since 1901, which were the documents relevant to the legal management of the estate and not the personal documents, which had been disposed of at various points in the trust's administration in the way that legal firms dispose of personal documents when the personal interest has ceased, and only the legal interest remains. The box contained the basic structure of the Fenwick story. The deaths of Robert and Alice Fenwick in 1899 in a boating accident on Poole Harbor, leaving 2 daughters, Eleanor aged 20 and Catherine aged 14, and an estate in the Dorset countryside that was substantial but not enormous, a property called Fenwick Grange, whose value and income the daughters would inherit at the age of majority or marriage, whichever came first. The appointment of Edmund Wilda, a solicitor and a distant cousin of Robert Fenwick, as the legal guardian of both daughters until Eleanor came of age in 1901, and then as the guardian of Catherine alone until her own majority. The portrait had been commissioned in 1901, coinciding with Eleanor's 21st birthday, which was the date at which Eleanor came of legal age and took formal possession of her share of the inheritance. The portrait was the documentary record of the occasion, the formal marking of the handover of a daughter from guardianship to independence, the specific Victorian and Edwardian custom of commemorating these legal transitions with portraiture. What the box did not contain was Eleanor Fenwick's subsequent life. There was no record in the donation box of Eleanor's activities or whereabouts after 1901, beyond a brief notation in the trust's records for 1903 that she had been certified by 2 physicians as suffering from a nervous disorder, and had been admitted to a private nursing home in Wiltshire at her guardian's arrangement, the nursing home's fees to be charged against the estate income. The notation was a legal formality, the record of a financial arrangement, and it said nothing about what the nervous disorder consisted of or why the guardian had made the arrangement, or where Eleanor had been in the 2 years between the portrait and the nursing home. There was a great deal the box did not contain. The box did contain one document that Dr. Marsh found at the bottom, under the solicitor's correspondence and the estate accounts, which was not a legal document and was not in the solicitor's hand. It was a letter, single-sided in a woman's hand, dated the 7th of March, 1901, 4 months before the portrait sitting in July of the same year. The letter was addressed to the firm of Watts and Hartley, solicitors of Bournemouth, which was not Edmund Wilda's firm. It was addressed, in other words, to another solicitor, a solicitor that was not the guardian. The letter said, "I am writing to you at the suggestion of a lady of my acquaintance who believes you may be able to advise me. My name is Eleanor Fenwick of Fenwick Grange, near Wareham. I am writing in some urgency because I believe that my guardian, Mr. Edmund Wilda of Wilda and Partridge, solicitors of Dorchester, has been managing the Fenwick estate in a manner that is inconsistent with the terms of the trust established under my father's will, specifically regarding the income due to my sister Catherine, who is 14 years old, and whose portion of the estate income I have reason to believe has been applied by Mr. Wilda to his own purposes, rather than to Catherine's benefit. I came of age on the 3rd of February, and I have been attempting to obtain a full accounting of the estate since that date, and I have been unable to obtain the accounting. And Mr. Wilda has told me on 3 separate occasions that the accounting will be provided, and it has not been provided." The letter said, "I am also writing to you because I am afraid for my sister." She said this directly and in those words, "I am afraid for my sister." She wrote, "My sister has expressed to me on several occasions her desire to leave Fenwick Grange, and to be placed with the family of a school friend in Bournemouth, whose mother has offered to receive her, and Mr. Wilda has refused to permit this arrangement, which he has the legal authority to refuse, until Catherine reaches 14 years of age, at which point I believe his guardianship of her transfers to me, and I intend to exercise that authority immediately." The letter said, "I am writing to ask whether you can advise me on the legal mechanism for obtaining the estate accounting, and for effecting the transfer of my sister's guardianship from Mr. Wilda to myself. And I am writing now rather than waiting because the situation at Fenwick Grange is not one that I am comfortable leaving unaddressed while the legal procedures are arranged." The letter was unsigned, or rather, it was initialed in the way that women of the period sometimes initialed personal correspondence that they feared might be intercepted, the initials EF in the bottom right corner rather than the full signature. There was no reply from Watts and Hartley in the box. Whether a reply had been sent and not retained, or whether the letter had never reached its addressee, or whether there had been some other obstruction between Eleanor's writing of the letter and the receiving of advice, Dr. Marsh could not determine from the box's contents. She could determine that the letter was in the box, which was the solicitor's box, which was Edmund Wilda's firm's box, which meant the letter had come to Wilda rather than to Watts and Hartley, which meant Eleanor's letter to the other solicitor had been intercepted. Dr. Marsh sat with this for a while. Then she went back to the portrait on the monitor. She looked at Eleanor Fenwick's white-knuckled hand. She looked at the edge of the folded paper between the fingers. She looked at Catherine, standing beside the hand and the paper, in the composed expression that the painter had directed her to hold, the specific composed expression of a 16-year-old girl who had been directed to look content, and who was looking as content as a girl can look when she is aware of what her sister is holding in the fold of her skirt. Catherine knew. The paper was visible in the fold of Catherine's skirt because Eleanor had put it there, in the moment before or during the sitting, in the specific place where it would be least visible from the painter's angle and most likely to survive the sitting without being found. She had tucked it into the fold of Catherine's dress and gripped it with her own hand to keep it there, and the painter had painted the grip and the fold and the barely visible edge of the paper with the accuracy of a man who was looking at what was in front of him, and whose job was to paint what he saw. Why in the portrait? Why in Catherine's dress? Why held in Eleanor's hand rather than simply concealed on Eleanor's person, which would have been less visible and less risky? Because the portrait was permanent. A concealed document on a person could be found and removed. A document in a portrait, painted into the composition by an oblivious professional, and sealed under oil and varnish and framed and hung on the wall of Fenwick Grange, would last. Eleanor Fenwick had understood in July of 1901 that the portrait that Edmund Wilda had commissioned to record the contentment and settled prosperity of his two wards was the most durable vessel available to her in which to hide the things she needed to hide, and she had hidden it, and she had been right about the durability, because it had lasted 120 years. Dr. Marsh petitioned the museum's director for permission to investigate whether the object visible in the portrait's restored detail was actually present in the paint layer or was an imaging artifact. The director agreed. A section of the paint layer in the relevant area of the canvas was examined under magnification with the specific technique used to determine whether an anomaly in the imaging is a feature of the surface or a feature of the imaging process. It was a feature of the surface. There was something under the paint in the area where the paper's edge was visible. The painter had painted over it, not deliberately, not with any awareness that he was painting over something that was not part of the formal composition, but because the paper was in the fold of Catherine's dress during the sitting, and he had painted the fold of Catherine's dress, and the hand on the fold, and the barely visible edge of the paper, with the completeness that a direct observation painter working from life applies to everything in the scene before him. Dr. Marsh wrote in the restoration record, "Physical examination confirms presence of subsurface element in right foreground, consistent with the imaging data. The element appears to be paper or a paper-like material, positioned between the paint surface and the canvas substrate. The element was present during the original painting session and was incorporated into the paint layer during the completion of the canvas. The element cannot be removed without significant damage to the painting." She wrote, "The element is not accessible without irreversible harm to the work." She wrote, "I am recommending a full investigation of the Fenwick family history to contextualize the element's presence and significance before any further action is taken on the physical investigation." The full investigation of the Fenwick family history took Dr. Marsh 6 months, in the time available from her conservation work, using the archive of Dorset County records and the records of the General Register Office and the Wiltshire County records, and the specific collection of the Bournemouth Local History Society, which maintained, among its holdings, the records of several legal firms that had operated in the Bournemouth area in the early 20th century, including the firm of Watts and Hartley. At Watts and Hartley's records, she found the other copy of Eleanor's letter. Eleanor had sent it twice, or she had attempted to send it twice, which was the inference available from the presence of both copies, one in Wilda's box intercepted, and one in the Watts and Hartley archive received. She had sent it twice, on different days, by different routes, because she was a woman of 21 who was operating in a situation of constraint, with the full intelligence available to a woman of her specific formation, and the specific urgency of a woman who was afraid for her sister. The second copy had arrived at Watts and Hartley. There was a reply in the archive, the reply that Watts and Hartley had sent to Eleanor in response to the letter. The reply was dated the 12th of March, 1901, and it advised Eleanor on the legal mechanisms she had asked about and confirmed that the transfer of guardianship was a straightforward procedure, and that an accounting of the estate was something she was entitled to request and receive. The reply said that Watts and Hartley would be pleased to act on her behalf. And then there was nothing further in the Watts and Hartley archive regarding the Fenwick matter. The correspondence ended. The case was not pursued. Eleanor Fenwick had written the letter and received the reply, and the reply had said that the procedure was straightforward, and that they would act on her behalf, and nothing further had happened. Dr. Marsh went to the Wiltshire County records. She found Eleanor Fenwick. She found the 2 physician certificates of 1903, the certification of the nervous disorder. She found the nursing home's records, the admission record, the treatment records, the discharge record which was dated 1909, and which recorded Eleanor as discharged to the care of her sister Catherine, who had by that point reached the age of majority and was living in Bournemouth. Catherine had reached the age of majority and had come for her sister. She had waited until she had the legal means to do something, and then she had done it. The discharge record was signed by Catherine Fenwick as the patient's receiving relative, and it was the most informative document in the Wiltshire records because it showed, in Catherine's signature, and in the specific circumstances of the discharge, everything about Catherine Fenwick, that the portrait of 1901 had been commissioned to conceal, which was that she was the kind of person who kept her sister's letter hidden in the fold of her dress, while a painter rendered them in the composed postures of contentment, and who went to get her sister when she could go, and who signed the discharge record with the specific authority of a woman who has been waiting 9 years to sign it. Dr. Marsh found both women in the 1911 census. Eleanor Fenwick, 41, retired, the retired being the census category for women of the period who were not employed outside the home, which was not informative. Catherine Fenwick, 26, teacher, the teacher being the specific information of a woman who had educated herself, and made herself useful, and made herself independent in the specific way available to a young woman of limited means, who had been under the authority of an inadequate guardian for 7 years, and who had decided that the relevant response to inadequate authority was to remove herself from the category of people who required authority. They were living together in Bournemouth, in a flat above a boarding house, which was not the ancestral family seat at Fenwick Grange. The estate had been substantially reduced by the period of Wilda's management, which was the specific information available from the estate accounts that the accounting eventually produced, which was not the accounting Eleanor had tried to produce in 1901, but the accounting that the trust's final dissolution in 1919 had required, and which showed what 20 years of Wilda's management had done to the estate's value, which was considerable in the direction of reduction. There was no legal action. There was never a legal action. Wilda had died in 1912, and the specific mechanism for an action against the estate of a deceased solicitor in the Edwardian period was not a mechanism that 2 women of reduced means and no influential connections could readily operate. The accounting showed the reduction. The accounting did not produce a remedy. The account shows this, which is the account's most unsatisfying and most accurate element. They lived in Bournemouth, Catherine taught. Eleanor, the census records after 1911, say retired in each return, until Eleanor's death in 1947 at the age of 68, which was the retirement of a woman who had been in a private nursing home for 6 years at a formative period of her adult life, and who came out of it diminished in the specific ways that those institutions diminished the people they contained, and who was cared for by her younger sister for the remaining 40 years of her life. Catherine Fenwick died in 1963 at the age of 78. She outlived her sister by 16 years. She had been a teacher until her retirement and had retired to the same flat above the Bournemouth boarding house, which was in different ownership by then, but the same address, and had lived there until her death, and had donated the portrait to the County Museum in 1974 through a solicitor's firm, with no explanation. She had kept the portrait all her life. She had kept the portrait that was commissioned to record her contentment at the age of 16, in which the painter had unwittingly documented her sister's white-knuckled grip on the folded paper in the fold of Catherine's dress, and she had kept it through the years in Bournemouth and through Eleanor's care, and through her own retirement, and into her own old age, and at the end she had given it to the museum without explanation. without explanation, except the explanation that was in the portrait itself, in the fold of her skirt, in the edge of the paper between Eleanor's white fingers. Dr. Marsh published the findings of the restoration investigation in a conservation journal in 2020. The article described the imaging results and the historical investigation, and was careful and precise in its language, in the specific way of a conservation scientist writing for a specialist journal, which is to describe what was found and what was determined, and to leave the interpretation to the reader. The article noted that the element under the paint's surface could not be recovered without irreversible damage to the work. The article noted that the historical investigation had contextualized the element, and that the contextualization was available in the article. The article noted that the portrait would remain on display at the Dorset County Museum, with updated documentation describing the element's presence and the historical circumstances that had produced it. The portrait is in the Dorset County Museum in Dorchester. The updated documentation is on the wall label beside it. The wall label describes the portrait in the standard terms of a family portrait of the period and adds, in its final paragraph, a brief note. High-resolution restoration imaging conducted in 2019 revealed an element incorporated into the paint surface in the area of the right foreground that investigation suggests was a folded document concealed within the composition during the sitting. The document cannot be recovered without damage to the painting. Its contents are unknown. The portrait's history is described in detail in the museum's digital archive. The museum's digital archive contains Dr. Marsh's full restoration record and the investigation's findings. It is accessible to anyone who requests access. This is what Dr. Marsh said in a recorded conversation about the investigation that she gave to a podcast on art conservation in 2021. She said, "The thing I keep coming back to is the painter." She said, "He was there. He was looking directly at Eleanor Fenwick's hand for the period it took to paint it, which in an oil portrait of this kind might have been 2 or 3 sessions, several hours total. He was looking at her hand and painting it with the accuracy of a professional who was being paid to record what he saw. And what he saw was a hand holding something, and he painted the hand holding the something, and he either did not notice what the something was or he noticed, and he continued painting." She said, "I prefer to believe he noticed and he continued painting because that interpretation makes the portrait more interesting." She said, "If he noticed and he continued painting, then the portrait is not only Eleanor's act of concealment, it is also the painter's act of recording. He saw what she was doing and he recorded it. He recorded it without making it legible to the commissioning guardian who was going to hang the portrait on his wall and who was going to look at it every time he walked through the drawing room, and who was never going to see what was in the fold of Catherine's dress at normal viewing distance." She said, "The painter painted what was in front of him and trusted that what was in front of him would survive in the paint. He was right about that. It survived 120 years. She said, "I am not claiming he made an ethical choice. I do not know that he did. I know only that the result of painting what he saw, including the thing he saw that was not supposed to be there, was that the thing that was not supposed to be there is there, in the paint, still there in the Dorset County Museum." She said, "Catherine kept the portrait her whole life." She said, "I think about this a lot. Catherine kept the portrait for 62 years after she got her sister out of the nursing home, through all the decades of their life together in Bournemouth, and she donated it at the end. She did not destroy it. She did not give it to anyone in the family. She gave it to the museum, which is where you give something when you want it to last and to be seen." She said, "I think she wanted someone to find it." She said, "I think she knew that eventually someone was going to look at the restoration imaging and see Eleanor's hand and see the paper and go looking for the story." She said, "She kept the portrait, so the story would have somewhere to be." She said, "The paper is still in the portrait. We cannot get it out without damaging the painting." She said, We don't know what it says. We may never know what it says. She said, but we know it is there. We know Eleanor put it there. We know Catherine stood beside her sister's grip and looked at the painter and looked composed, for as long as the sitting took, because her sister needed the sitting to last long enough for the painting to be complete. She said, we know Eleanor was afraid for her sister and afraid for herself, and she used the only tool available to her that would last, which was the portrait that was being commissioned to say she was content. She said, the portrait was supposed to be the record of the guardian's management of the Fenwick sisters, the record of two young women in their proper place, properly managed, properly contained. She said, Eleanor made the portrait into a different record. She put the truth in the painting. They commissioned to show the lie. She said, that is the thing I keep coming back to. The painting they commissioned to show the lie is the painting that is showing us the truth. The guardian commissioned it and it is working for Eleanor, she said, 120 years later, and it is still working for Eleanor. She said she won. She said it simply, not triumphantly. The nursing home was real and the 9 years were real and the estate was diminished and there was no legal remedy. She said it the way you say things that are simply true, she said. She found the tool that would last, and she used it. And 120 years later it is still working, and we are still reading it. The portrait of the Fenwick sisters, 1901, is on the wall of the Dorset County Museum. Eleanor Fenwick's hand is in the fold of Catherine's dress. The paper is in the grip. The painter painted what he saw. Go and look at it. Stand at the distance where it looks like a family portrait of two composed young women in their proper Edwardian place, and it will look like that. Then look at Eleanor's right hand. Find where it falls between the two women's bodies. Find the position of the fingers. Then move closer. Move close enough that the composition blurs and the detail sharpens, and the distance between what the guardian commissioned and what the painter actually recorded collapses into the specific resolution of what is actually there, in the fold of the fabric, in the white grip of the knuckles. She put the truth where it would last. It lasted.